Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tomorrow, ASEAN leaders will hold a special summit to try and persuade Myanmar's junta to end the violence in the country and let in humanitarian aid. The summit is important because it's the first concerted regional effort to try and ease the political crisis in Myanmar. But will ASEAN be able to successfully navigate the Myanmar crisis? And if it fails, will it be able to maintain its centrality in issues of regional security? Let's begin our conversation tonight with His Excellency Eric Paulsen, representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Eric, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. All eyes on ASEAN this weekend and its ability to use its diplomatic heft to help steer Myanmar back to a democratic path. Now, I'm wondering, Eric, do you think that there will likely be a conclusive outcome for Myanmar from this summit?
Thank you, Melisa and Sharaad, for having me. I think we have to put things in context. ASEAN is a regional body. It believes in processes. The fact that ASEAN has issued 2 statements on this particular issue, and has taken the extremely unusual step of convening the Leaders' Summit, a mere 2.5 months after the crisis, is already a huge step in terms of all the ASEAN leaders coming together to meet face to face in order to try to resolve this particular crisis. I think realistically we should keep our expectation real. This is the first time all the leaders will be meeting. And I think it's interesting that the framing of this particular meeting has been called the ASEAN Leaders Meeting. It is not the ASEAN Summit. And I think the implication is that, that they would like to meet General Min Aung Hlaing, who's currently here, to meet the ASEAN leaders.
Eric, when you, in your recent piece for The Star, kind of talked about it, a now or never situation for ASEAN, one of the things you pointed to was the ASEAN Charter and its relationship to the summit, meaning that there is some ability, some leverage on the part of ASEAN to demand from its members compliance with the Charter, or to some realignment with the Charter. Could you help us understand that process and to what extent this might be utilized at the summit over the weekend?
Well, ASEAN has existed for a long time without a charter in place. The charter was only put in place, drafted and adopted back in 2007. And so it is really quite a new document. But I think it's an important landmark in terms of ASEAN because now it is now a rules-based organization, and within the rules-based organization are such important principles as democracy, rule of law, and good governance. And I think one of the most cherished principle within ASEAN, or the purpose of ASEAN, is that the whole region in ASEAN must be stable, secure, and peaceful, and so that the whole region can be prosperous. Obviously, this is just a document, and this charter is only as good as all the members are willing to abide by the contents. What we have here today is of course something quite, it is quite extreme. The Tatmadaw has ousted a popular government. They won by a landslide in the November election. The state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, the president Win Min, they are under house arrest, and there are numerous other political detainees. And the Tatmadaw has shown that it's able to use extreme force to terrorize the public. So it is a very tough situation.
Right. And on that note, Eric, ASEAN has been criticized for inviting General Min Aung Hlaing to the leaders' meeting. And some people have painted this to be perhaps a tacit recognition of the junta and, by extension, the violence by the junta. How do you see this in terms of its invitation? Is this recognition of the Myanmar military government?
Well, I think that would be not the correct way of looking at things, because the ground reality is that it is a Tatmadaw that has caused this particular problem, and in addressing this particular problem, the problem maker would need to be part of the solution. I think ASEAN, in whether publicly or privately, must make clear that it's not conferring legitimacy to the Tatmadaw. It has called itself the State Administration Council now, and it is mainly engaging them to find a solution to the crisis. I think it's also worthy to note that the Malaysia's position, for example, in the last couple of hours, there was a press statement from Wisma Putra that has stated that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister they will be attending this particular summit. It will be attended by ASEAN leaders as well as General Min Aung Hlaing. So the implication is that Malaysia's position is that it has not yet recognized General Min Aung Hlaing as the leader of Myanmar.
Right. Well, what about the CRPH, the body that now claims to be the legitimate government? What role do they play in ASEAN? From as far as you know, is ASEAN engaging with them in order to keep them in the loop or make them party to negotiations, as it were?
Sure. I think the CRPH now is known as the National Unity Government, but their position is extremely fragile because the SAC has deemed this organization to be unlawful. There have been arrest warrants out for most of their members. Many of them are in hiding or in neighboring states. But nonetheless, I recognize that they are the legitimate representative of the people of Myanmar because, after all, they won the election. I know that publicly, at least, Indonesia, for example, has spoken to members of the CRPH, and I hope there will be tentative meetings between CRPH and or this NUG with other ASEAN member states, and hopefully in the future with ASEAN.
Eric, as an advocate of human rights, what kind of approach can we see coming out of ASEAN? What kind of wiggle room will there be possible? For instance, should there be a decoupling between a kind of maximalist position on the return to the democratic path, a return to the NLD leadership in government, and say perhaps humanitarian issues that could be resolved by demanding de-escalation of violence? Is it possible to decouple these in the present situation?
Well, I think negotiations and mediation, I think you have to take it step by step. It's an ongoing process. You need to build trust and confidence. But I think first and foremost, I think the immediate demand must be an immediate cessation of violence. And the safety and protection of the civilian population must be the top priority. And then I think we certainly should look into issues like a humanitarian pause so that humanitarian aid could be delivered to the whole country.
All right. Thank you, Eric, so much for speaking with us tonight. We appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. More on this topic in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This.
Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada support system. This is chain reaction. Polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distance.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa. Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. We continue to look at the political and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar through the lens of diplomatic efforts at this weekend's ASEAN Special Summit. Debbie Stothard is the founder of the democracy advocacy group Alternative ASEAN Network on Burma. Debbie, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'm wondering what do you think democratic forces and the Myanmar public, most of whom voted for the ousted NLD government, what do you think they would want from this ASEAN leaders meeting? Well, more generally ASEAN, but more specifically tomorrow's ASEAN leaders meeting?
I think it's pretty clear, resoundingly, that they want the national unity government, which represents 76% of elected MPs and ethnic organizations, to be recognized and invited to the dialogue table. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing heads an illegal junta, even illegal under his own the military constitution of the country.
Debbie, do you think that there is some benefit from having Min Aung Hlaing in Indonesia for the meeting, that it will pave the way for some sort of confidence building and perhaps allow ASEAN to leverage whatever it has to push Myanmar back onto a kind of democratic trajectory?
Let's be frank about this. When the Indonesian foreign minister and the Thai foreign minister met with the illegal junta's representatives in Bangkok 2 months ago, they basically said to their emissary, please don't be violent. And how the junta responded was by escalating the violence 2 days later. On March the 27th, during the Armed Forces Day, 3 ASEAN countries, including Thailand, sent their defense attaches to pay respects at the festivities of the armed forces, the Tatmadaw. And the next day, the armed forces of the military junta launched airstrikes on the Thai border. In fact, yesterday, the Burmese military fired upon the Thai border security forces. So we know very well that this junta does not have much respect for ASEAN. What ASEAN needs to do is it needs to show it's serious by inviting the NUG, the National Unity Government, to the table, and also inviting the UN Security Council to get involved.
Well, what else can ASEAN do, Debbie? I'm just wondering, I mean, coming up from the leaders meeting tomorrow, what would you like to see in terms of concrete action? If you say that the junta has no respect for ASEAN, what else can ASEAN do short of suspending Myanmar's membership to the bloc?
Well, suspension is a very good idea. They should put that on the table and tell Min Aung Hlaing, if you don't halt the violence, we will suspend your membership. But just as importantly, they should be involved. They should be actually extending. ASEAN should be asking for a partnership with the UN Security Council to work jointly on handling the Myanmar crisis. Otherwise, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has already warned that Myanmar could very easily deteriorate into a Syria-type situation, which is not something that ASEAN can afford.
Debbie, we've been down this road once before. 20 years ago, ASEAN was dealing with the military government and worked with it in order to nudge it onto a path towards democracy. Is that still available in terms of the scenarios? Is the situation now akin to what it was before the kind of democratic breakthrough that they had less than 10 years ago?
Look, we now have 3,000. Okay, so now we have 3,370 political detainees and another 1,000 people being hunted down by this military. The last time we had 3,000 political prisoners in Myanmar was in 1991, 30 years ago. We're talking about a scenario not 20 years ago, but 30 years ago. And this is why when we see every time there has been a step forward secured by ASEAN, ASEAN has done it with the backing of key dialogue partners like the Security Council, like the US government, etc. ASEAN cannot do this alone.
Debbie, you mentioned that you're concerned the situation in Myanmar could deteriorate to a Syria-type situation. Could you explain what you mean by that? And I'm just wondering whether you've seen a change in the attitudes of the military, whether it's hardening, because resistance to the coup has continued. Yes.
Resistance to the coup has continued on a daily basis, and what we have seen instead of massive rallies is lightning strikes in order to evade security forces all around the country. But also in places like Tamu and Kalay in Sagaing division near the India border, it's been a war zone because local farmers are using muskets and slingshots to resist the military, which is using rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns, but they're still fighting it out. What we've seen in these past few weeks is the simmering civil wars happening along the border areas has now been escalated to a nationwide civil war by military aggression. This is very serious. The military is being more aggressive because it has lost control of the country, the civil administration, and the economy. They are using violence to try and suppress all of this and regain control, and they are not actually succeeding. And this is why ASEAN needs to step in with some muscle, with some resolve, instead of saying, oh, please don't be violent, it's not nice. That is no longer viable. ASEAN needs to be forceful, it needs to bring all parties to the table, and it needs to take a very strong human rights principles on this.
Debbie, do you think the international context today favors a swift resolution to the problem? The new Biden administration, China's seeming ambivalence towards the coup, but then again, you have Russia's interest in the region kind of emerging strangely, a couple of weeks ago, and then of course India's relative silence. How do all these things play into the current situation? Does it lead to a call for optimism or pessimism?
Well, ASEAN should have had this summit 2 months ago on February the 24th, not April the 24th, first thing. Second thing, China has actually engaged in dialogue with the National Unity Government, and ASEAN has not even done that. China hasn't been ambivalent about the coup because they understand that stability is important to their economic and political interests. ASEAN seems to have fallen down on that sense. They have not taken this crisis seriously, and they're waking up a little bit late at this point. So ASEAN needs to come in hard and firm on Min Aung Hlaing and actually put the idea of ASEAN membership suspension on the table. They need to bring in the Security Council, and they need to start a dialogue with the National Unity Government, which is the legal government.
Debbie, thank you for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate you spending time and sharing your insights. We appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, we're going to take another quick break, but there's still so much more to unpack on this issue, so stay tuned to consider this.
Firdaus, apa lagi agaknya perincian terbaru dalam proses rayuan bekas Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Razak Razak hari ini?
Telah menyebabkan pasukan pembelaan gagal.
Tular kononnya meninggal dunia selepas komplikasi.
Ke depan dan maju. Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada support system. This is extreme action.
Polisi, kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face masks, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Bila sentuh soal berita, tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. AWANI 745 lebih awal dari biasa.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir.
Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about ASEAN's ability to resolve the crisis in Myanmar ahead of the bloc's special leaders meeting tomorrow. Michael Vatikiotis is the Asia Director for the Centre of Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a private diplomacy organisation. He's also the author of Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia. Michael, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Now, with the coup, have we returned to a time before the democratic opening of Myanmar? And can the role that ASEAN played then be reprised now? Or do you think that the conditions have changed so fundamentally that ASEAN needs a new playbook?
Well, I think what's changed, Melisa, is that the way in which we look at these events in sort of real time has actually brought everything into the front rooms, to the meeting rooms, to the halls of government in a much more vivid way, which has made, I think, the current events in Myanmar much more urgent, at least for governments. So I think in the past, governments were able to sort of look at these events with a little bit more perspective. But now that's no longer possible. They have constituencies that are demanding action. There is social media on a daily or hourly or minute-by-minute basis that's bringing disturbing, distressing scenes into everyone's lives. And so really the urgency to do something, the compulsion to do something is very much there now compared in the past.
Michael, what are the real options before ASEAN in dealing with this situation?
Well, I think we really have, there's a lot of, ASEAN is a very convenient punch bag because people always say it can't do anything, it needs to act, it has a charter, it doesn't live up to. I mean, let's put it in perspective. ASEAN for 50 years, more than 50 years, has essentially kept the peace between the countries of Southeast Asia, and that's what it was designed to do. It was designed essentially to prevent interstate conflict, and it's done that job. It was never really designed to address issues within countries, within member states. When the ASEAN Charter was framed a few years ago, that came up. And of course, the whole notion of shared values, of human rights, of the need to act in the interests of people rather than states became much more, at least, considered. There was a real test a few years ago, I mean, back in 2007, 2008, when Myanmar, there was a round of violence in Myanmar, and similarly, there were demands for actions, and action wasn't really taken. I think this time, the pressure on ASEAN member states and the leaders is immense to actually do something, because their credibility is on the line. Not so much as ASEAN as an organization, but all the countries and their constituencies, their people, who are, I think, much more demanding now of action. And I think that's why we're likely to see perhaps some action taken tomorrow at the summit.
What kind of action do you reckon might be taken, Michael? Because we just spoke to Debbie Stothard a couple of minutes ago, and she's saying that ASEAN needs to be far more forceful, really needs to step in with resolve. She even suggested, that suspending Myanmar's membership from the bloc should be on the table. What do you think would be a likely outcome a realistic outcome from the leaders' meeting tomorrow?
Well, I think suspending Myanmar is not going to achieve anything other than isolating it further. I mean, what's needed is engagement and intervention of some kind. And I think what will be discussed tomorrow are two possible plans. One is a plan for humanitarian intervention. Obviously, the humanitarian needs, the human security issues in Myanmar are enormous and are mounting daily. And I think it's felt by some member states that one entry point to the country would be to propose humanitarian assistance. The other plan is somewhat more sedate, sort of classic high diplomacy, which is, let's form a group of friends, let's have special envoy, to sort of try and talk to the army in Myanmar and try to bring the stakeholders together. A combination of two is probably what is needed. A combination of a humanitarian action plan, one that essentially uses the humanitarian space to actually gain access to the country so that other conversations can be had about ending violence, about promoting dialogue and finding a solution. And also a special envoy. That could be the Secretary General himself. It could be someone that the ASEAN leaders appoint, someone to work the diplomacy full time to gain that access to the country and start to talk to all the stakeholders.
Michael, do you think the key is what is in the mind of the military at the moment of Min Online? There is some debate about when this coup was hatched, whether the military had decided in 2015 to give up on democracy, or was it just because they had failed in November last year to win popular support through an election, and that had somehow disappointed them and they decided to roll back the democratic project? How do you see this? Is it regime type? Is it one man's ambition or an institution's insecurities?
I really think it's hard to speculate on exactly what happened. I mean, we can guess that there was an initial argument over the election itself that then escalated with lack of compromise on both sides, the failure to negotiate a way out, and then ultimately a coup d'etat. And that's ultimately driven the army towards the need to completely try at all costs to gain mastery over the population. There's no turning the military. That's why we've seen levels of violence that are obviously unacceptable and brutal. But there really is no choice for them. They have to move forward, otherwise they would lose everything. And so I think the story is not yet written of exactly what happened. I think that's something that will have to happen later on. For the time being, we need to focus on de-escalation. We need to focus on helping the country pull back from the brink of state failure. We need to find an off-ramp for the military. We find a win-win situation for all sides, so that that somehow a negotiated solution can be found.
Lastly, which international players do you think, Michael, will be the most have the most heft in the current situation, and what do you think they want to see the scenario play out?
Well, let's be clear. I think China, the US, all the major powers, for the time being, are relying on the regional states, in particular on ASEAN, to find a way. I think the next line of offense, if you like, would be if ASEAN fails to hatch a plan or appoint an envoy tomorrow, and there's no consensus. I think it'll be left to a subset of ASEAN member states, perhaps Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, perhaps Singapore, core states, perhaps Thailand as well, who will then, as a subset of ASEAN, try themselves to launch some kind of diplomatic initiative. If that fails, then I think it'll fall to individual statesmen in the region to try themselves. But I think we're still very much in the situation where the region has to try first before other powers are willing to be involved.
Michael, thank you for speaking with us tonight. Appreciate your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. But before we leave you, a quick reminder, don't forget to get all the latest news and information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com and the Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan, signing off for the week.
We'll be back with you same time on Monday. Till then, have a great weekend, folks.